Welcome to week 2 of our 5-part webinar series, going over some advocacy tools and tips. So yeah, welcome all. This is going to be an hour-and-a-half webinar.
And Kenneth and I will be leading you through today's session. My name's Robin. You just met Kenneth. We are campaigns officers at Results Canada. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Results Canada, we are an advocacy organization that is driven by the mission to generate the political will necessary to end extreme poverty. And we're doing this in collaboration with OCIC. So I'm going to turn over to our partners there to introduce themselves.
Thanks, Robin. My name is Eugenia. Some of you might know me. I see a lot of new faces, but also a lot of people in our community. So I'm OCIC's Community Engagement Specialist. And if you haven't come across OCIC before, the long name is Ontario Council for International Cooperation. We're a network of over 100 organizations, institutions, and individuals working towards sustainable development. And this kind of partnership is exactly in the spirit of how we like to be. We're super happy that it's come to be in this way and bring forward the amazing work of one of our members, which in this case is Results Canada. We are also based in the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Métis, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. I'll pass it back to you, Robin.
Thank you, Eugenia. All right, so just some housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send you a recording of this after today's session in case you want to rewatch it or share it with all of your friends. Please do keep yourself muted throughout the session so that we can hear the speakers clearly. If you do want to speak, you can use the raise your hand function in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on that and pass the microphone over to you. Do know that we will have some designated Q&A periods, and we'd love to hear your voice. So if you're comfortable speaking, just raise your hand. You could also use the chat box though, if that's your preference. This is a webinar series, so you are getting emails from us on a weekly basis about what's coming next. Please do check your junk folders though, because sometimes they can slip into our junk email folders instead. So if you're missing those, just take a peek there because they might actually be there. And we'd love to see your face. So if you're able to and comfortable doing so, please turn on your video so we can all smile at one another and do some of this as we're liking the content shared. And so this is part of our 5-week series. This week, we are focusing on how to plan an advocacy strategy. Coming up next will be Who's Got the Power, the ins and outs of parliamentarian advocacy. And I'm going to hand it over to Kenneth to go over the objectives of today.
Right. So yeah, we have 3 objectives we're trying to achieve today with today's webinar. The first is to give you all a clear understanding of the key components that go into an advocacy strategy. This is something we touched on a little bit last week in the Advocacy 101 session, but we're going to be doing a bit more of a deep dive into that. We're also going to be sharing some tools, tricks, and tips for how to actually build out some of these components of advocacy strategies and hopefully allow you to actually be able to understand that a little bit. And of course, we're going to be trying to work in some of our own insights from the work that we've been doing, planning some campaigns in the past. We have an agenda as well for today, which is just obviously to start with a welcome and continue to have some opportunities to get to know one another. We'll be then going over some of how to build an advocacy strategy. You'll be listening to Robin and I sort of go through each of those components a little bit. We'll try to keep it quick and really informative for you all. And then we're going to have you break out into groups and actually start to design your own campaigns. We say design your own campaigns. It's not going to be a perfect exercise. You obviously couldn't necessarily do this fully within the time we're going to allot. Couldn't even do it within the full hour and a half that we have for this webinar. But it'll be some hands-on experience to let you sort of work through that process a little bit. Then we'll be bringing back for a final Q&A and a sneak peek and wrap up. And just something I want to make a bit of amendment here too is we are also going to make sure we have some opportunities for questions throughout as well. It's not just going to be that final Q&A. Just before we jump into diving a bit more deeply into the campaign planning, I wanted to just remind everyone of 3 key points I think we want everyone to keep in mind from last week that are going to be really important for this week. The first one is a bit of the difference between advocacy and activism. We have designed this particular webinar to go over how to sort of come up with an advocacy campaign, not necessarily an activist campaign. There will be a lot of crossover elements between the two, but they aren't necessarily going to be the exact same. And for anybody that might have been missed last week, the difference between advocacy and activism is usually divided between sort of trying to work from the inside, trying to work with the institutions within the situation that you have to create change. Activism is more taking to the streets, protesting, trying to actually think about, a more quote unquote radical or outside approach. The second one we want to bring up again is the context of advocacy work. I think we talked a little bit about international development work and the fact that when we do international development campaigning, we have to be really aware of the fact that of where Canadians are at and how Canadians think about international development programming. But this is something I think when we go into the scenarios and try to build out some of your own campaigns, you have to be very acutely aware of what the general discussion about your particular issue might be and how you think people might support or not support what you're aiming to achieve. And the last and probably most important piece is that you have the power. In advocacy work, you are an engaged, active citizen. You have a lot of power in changing the minds of decision makers, but also of the Canadian public and people around you. So just make sure you remind yourself of that.
All right, so last week, Taryn shared this really helpful slide that gives a comprehensive overview of the different components that go into building a strong advocacy strategy. For the sake of time, today we're going to dive particularly deep into points 3, 4, and 5 that are highlighted on the screen, and we'll get to some of the other elements later in the workshop series.
So again, this is two things we wanted to briefly discuss when you're going over how to build an advocacy strategy, but not necessarily do a deep dive into, and that's educating yourself on the issue that you want to advocate on, and identifying the issue and then educating yourself. Identifying the issue is actually in some ways the easiest step, in some ways the most difficult step. Easiest in the sense that I think we are all, because you're attending a webinar like this, passionate, engaged people who care about the world and care about creating some sort of change. And I think you can come up with a list of number of things that you think you'd want to advocate on. And that's also what makes it the most difficult. Actually being able to develop focus and trying to think about what is the specific thing you want to change, the specific issue you want to change, how you want to focus. Another thing to keep in mind here is you also want to make sure you're trying to really pick an issue that you can change and not be fatigued by all of the problems in the world. We are still people. We need to make sure that we try our best to channel our efforts where we can create some change and not burn ourselves out. On educating yourself, I think one of the most important things you can do when you're educating yourself on an issue is to listen to people that are most directly impacted by your issue. This is, I think, a really important step in trying to really be humble and think through those who might actually know more about an issue than you because they're being directly affected by something. This is important for any sort of work you try to do, but it's something that comes up quite a lot, particularly with marginalized or vulnerable populations. You want to make sure you're very aware of that. And then finally, you also want to make sure you really accept you might not have all the answers, and that shouldn't necessarily stop you. And you want to educate yourself so you feel really informed and prepared, but you might never know everything. And that's just sort of the nature of being human. So next slide, please, Robin. The first thing we wanted to dive into and really focus on was trying to identify targets for your advocacy strategy and your advocacy campaign. This is, again, a slide you would have seen last week, trying to differentiate between decision makers and influencers. This is a really important distinction when you're developing an advocacy campaign. And it's important because you need to know who you're going to be targeting for what specific things. So decision makers are people that actually have the power to create the change that you want, either the power to create new regulations or new policies, new laws, potentially fund new projects, and actually make the decision. This group actually can often be quite limited in terms of like the actual people that have final decision-making power, but they're all directly connected to influencers. And so influencers are people that in some way, shape, or form have the power to change the mind of a decision maker. This is something you can go as broad as like public figures and the media who kind of set the tone for how we think about various issues. But also, like, if you're thinking about members of parliament or the prime minister or a minister, you're thinking about constituents, voters, people who have some sort of democratic power. And again, the last point we had there on the influencers is something important to remember. You are part of that too. So when you're going through, next slide, please, Robin. How do you identify targets? So again, you want to start with your decision maker. Who is in the position of power to create change that you want to see? This is something you might have a very clear picture of right away. You might know exactly the person who has the power to create the change, but you might not. And I think once you get into some of the scenarios, this might be something you might have to explore. When you're designing an advocacy campaign, it's always a bit of an art, and you might not exactly be able to figure out the right person right away, but you always want to be thinking about who is the person going to create the change. And then from there, you can start to build out a model of people who can influence this person, as we talked about before. And then you also want to understand how important each of the influencers and decision makers are, right? Sometimes there might be multiple decision makers, but one person might have more power over the decision than another. Same thing with influencers. And then from that point, you want to kind of really think about, of the decision makers and influencers, who are your natural allies? Who are the people that you think are more on board with the change you want to create, that you might be able to use to get that change created and quickly and fluidly? And just as importantly, you want to identify some of the people that might be naturally opposed to you, which is always difficult to do, but great. So two ways I'm going to present to you two exercises for ways that you can possibly try to do this. The first is creating a systems map. This is where you start with a topic or a change that you want to create. And then sort of like a mind mapping exercise, but without actually making the connections directly. You want to issue little bubbles that in the center is the change you want to create, and then on the outside you start to fill in people that might be involved in the decision or influencing the decision in some way. You can freestyle this, put people, institutions, like individual names or large groups. But then after that, you want to start drawing in connections to see how each of these decision makers and influencers is connected to one another. The second exercise that we have that's often quite useful that we use is a power mapping exercise. So this is if you already have kind of an idea of who your targets might be. You want to have your final, and then you want to think of your final decision maker. Who's the final decision maker? And then you want to think about how mapping people onto this little graph that you see here of how much are they for you versus against you, and how much influence do they have to the decision maker versus no influence over the decision maker. Obviously, you want to try and really focus on, this will help you focus on trying to think of the people that are in your top right quadrant there, the people that are for you and have strong influence, and identifying some of the people that might be your opponents who also will be quite influential, but maybe against you. So this is a really good idea to try and see how you can think here. An example that we use here, we have a vaccines work campaign, which is trying to increase funding to global vaccine programs. When we did a similar mapping exercise, and this is, believe me, this got quite long, and there was a couple different chart papers taped together, but I tried to replicate some of it here. We mapped out all of the different actors that might be connected into this issue, as you see with the bubbles here. And if you, Robin, flip to the next slide, we identified three groups and institutions that actually will be critical for us to secure the support of in order to create this change. And so now we're thinking about global vaccine programs, and it's part of our international assistance funding, we have to think about the Minister of International Development, her colleagues in cabinet, and the Prime Minister as having some sort of decision-making power in this. The other blue bubbles you see around the outside are also critically important people, but they might be influencers. And how they will connect to those decision makers is also really important to understand. So next slide. Yeah.
All right, so let's dive a little bit deeper into how we might be able to define a strong advocacy related ask. So I'm sure many of you have seen the W's and the SMART framework come across your work in a lot of instances where you're putting together goals or objectives. And that's really because it's the meat and potatoes of how you get people to take specific action within a time-bound period of time. So I'm gonna integrate the vaccines work campaign that we're working on into my explanation of this, just to give you a bit of an understanding of how this really comes to life. So at a high level, first you'll want to go through your W's. So who, which specific decision maker or key stakeholder do you want to take action? And Kenneth already walked us through some of this. So it's the government of Canada broadly, but we need to engage the Prime Minister's office, the Prime Minister himself, the Minister of International Development, and probably stakeholders from Global Affairs Canada, etc. The what action do we want those decision makers to take? At a high level, we want increased funding towards global vaccine programs. When might we want this to happen? Well, we know because we work with multilateral institutions that do this type of work, like Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. We know that they have typical replenishment cycles when they're looking for new investment. We know that they set up pledging conferences where they're expecting governments to come out with ambitious pledges. So we kind of know our time frame based on what's happening in the broader ecosystem of the global health sector. And then the why. So how will this help you achieve your ultimate goal? Well, us at Results Canada, we're on a mission to end extreme poverty. And we know that children need to be healthy in order to thrive. So it aligns well with our organizational objectives. So once you've got that high level framing of the W's, you can dive a little bit more deeper by getting SMART. So we know that SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. So rather than talking you through the points on the slides, let's look at this in the example of the ask that we could have come up with within our vaccines work campaign. So vaccines work. Let's look at these. The first example on the screen, we are calling on the government of Canada to pledge to global vaccine programs, is good because it identifies the decision maker that we want to act, the government of Canada, and it indicates what we want them to do, to pledge to global vaccine programs. We could, however, get a little bit more specific. Why? Because we know the ecosystem of global health, and we know that multilaterals exist that do this type of programming. So we know that we want money to funnel through the Global Polio Eradication Initiative and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. But again, we can get even more specific with this ask because we've done our homework, we've engaged our stakeholders, and we've done a bit of an analysis to think about what amount of money might be needed to save a certain number of lives or vaccinate a certain number of children. And multilateral institutions, they tend to come out with investment cases themselves. And then our job as a civil society organization based in Canada is to kind of vet what they're asking the Canadian government for, do our own research, and come up with something that we think is achievable and realistic within the Canadian context of official development assisted contributions. So the overarching takeaway here is be as specific as you can with the ask that you put together, because the specificity of this means we're more likely to have the government or the decision maker take the action in the end. And Kenneth, you want to walk over some tactics?
Yeah, and this is the last key component that we're going to be really focusing on for this webinar. Again, we'll go through the last few steps as well, but tactics are really important. The tactics that you use are actually, this is especially important to remember that they are kind of only limited by your imagination. You have to try and think through how you're going to get your message to the decision makers and influencers, allies and partners that you have identified. So you're sort of combining your ask and your targets, and trying to think about what ways can you actually try to communicate that ask really effectively to them. We've listed some examples here of things that we like to use that we find quite helpful and effective in terms of having meetings with decision makers, trying to get engaged with the media with op-eds or letters to the editor, trying to get other articles published in the media by reporters, trying to do some social media outreach. Webinars and conferences are great ways if you're trying to educate the general public or particular groups of people. Position papers, briefing documents are also really good if you feel like you need something really like detailed and gritty. And public stunts are great sort of like public engagement exercises if you want to do something really loud and engaging. But I think what you want to be remembering, and Robin, if you could go to the next slide, when you're trying to develop your tactics, is to try and ask yourself some key questions. The first one is sort of who you are as an individual or who you are as an organization. And what this means is like, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What are the tactics you've used before? What are the things that you have some really good experience with and think you can execute really well? Because you can choose a bunch of really great tactics, but if you're not going to be able to deliver them, it's going to be much harder to do. You also have to think about who your targets are. Again, who the decision makers are, or the people you're trying to, the influencers who you're trying to get to influence the decision maker. What do they respond really well to? This is something you can go through both as, like generally what do members of parliament respond well to, for example. But also if you have a lot of really good information about a particular member of parliament, what does that one member of parliament respond well to? What does the prime minister or his office respond well to? What does the minister or her office respond well to? The more information you have here, the easier it'll become to try and identify those tactics. And again, you want to be thinking of, and you also want to be thinking about the resources you have access to. I think we can all very much be very ambitious in how we try to think through all the crazy, amazing tactics that we can do, and we may be inspired by the work that other organizations are doing, but it's really critical to also think about what resources do you have access to so that you can reasonably pull off these tactics really effectively. And similarly with other points here, I want to go over some examples from the Vaccines Work campaign. So these are listing out some of the tactics we've rolled out for this campaign. When we've been trying to engage decision makers, we've had meetings with decision makers at Global Affairs. So there's people who work on global vaccine programs and are going to be providing recommendations and part of the decision-making process. So we have meetings with them, try to keep them informed of some of our recommendations and our thoughts. We ask our grassroots, and we as a staff also attend meetings with members of parliament and with senators. We also get letters written to those to MPs and emails out to MPs as well to continue those really rich forms of engagement when we can't necessarily meet with them. Again, we with media, we do lots of op-eds and LTEs, and the results for volunteers are fantastic at getting these things published. We've done some social media outreach. Last month for World Immunization Week, for example, we had a Twitter chat where we sort of took to Twitter and got a hashtag vaccines for results and vaccines work trending in Canada, which is a really good way to get the conversation continuing. And then we also coordinate a lot with our partners and allies. So there's a lot of other civil society organizations. We also work with some of these multilaterals that we're advocating for, and have regular meetings, share information, like try to keep each other informed on how we can push the campaign forward. We're not working in this alone, but we have to think about how we're adding some unique value. And then finally, some education and public outreach stuff. So we do produce resources and materials for both our volunteers and for decision makers, so that people have access to stuff that definitively proves them that what we already know is that vaccines are such effective tools for public health, and we need to be able to share that case with people. We also host webinars with some really fantastic speakers. And again, in April, we had a fantastic webinar with some folks that work on vaccine programs around the world, from Nigeria to Kenya to Afghanistan. and they got to share their stories, and particularly talking about how COVID's impacting global vaccine programs. And that was a really great webinar, and it was really well attended. So it really did push that educational piece forward. So yeah, back to you, Robin.
Great. And just to say, I know earlier Kenneth gave a high-level overview of what we see as the distinction between advocacy and activism, but part of your advocacy tactic toolkit can include activist-like activities. We like to try and develop advocacy strategies that include inside-outside tactics, so that we're doing some soft engagement with some of those key decision makers within Global Affairs Canada and the Prime Minister's office, etc. And then we also have some more of our outside actions that our volunteers and constituents can take and be a little bit more vocal and heavy hitting on how they engage. So yeah, let's move on to the final bit, monitoring evaluation. We're not going to dive deep into this by any means, but we just wanted to say up front that when you're designing an advocacy strategy, M&E needs to be done in the beginning. It's not just something you tack on at the end. It's something you should think about going into your campaign. And your campaign will have, of course, your main objective of achieving your advocacy ask, but you might also want to tack on some objectives around building out your network and your community and your relationship with civil society organizations working in the space, because that will be a good thing for your future advocacy efforts. Or you might want to build some relationship with members of parliaments, etc. So it doesn't have to just be that one goal. Think about what's good for you as an organization in the long term as well. And once you've done that, then you can really start to identify how you might be able to measure your success and establish some key indicators for that. So I'll just give some examples here with our Vaccines Work campaign. We might measure the success of this based on whether or not we had realized the government to pledge the amount of money we asked for. That's one big indicator of success. We might measure the number of meetings that we've had with members of parliaments or numbers of engagement we've had with them. So for example, in the lead up to World Immunization Week, we sent out members of parliament an Take Action email, educating them about what the week is all about and giving them some ways that they could engage on their own social media accounts. So we might measure how much uptake we got from that end. We might look at how many civil society organizations participated or signed on to our ask, etc. So make sure that you don't just leave this to the end. It is critical to looking at up front and is important for you to reflect on so that you can be iterative in your campaign process, mid-campaign, during campaign, and also that you can just get better at designing campaigns and implementing them into the future. So any questions? I think we've got a few minutes for questions from the audience. So 5 minutes if anybody has any questions, and then we're going to break out and design our own campaign strategies.
And sorry, Rob, I'll just jump in here because I see that Rochelle has asked a question in the chat box, which is, could you talk a little bit more about the point about knowing who you are as an organization? Advocacy tactics would have to align with your organization's brand and mission, but also how do you advocate if your org is depending on the government for funding? Yeah, and I think Rochelle, you gave some actually great insights in the question as well. The point about one of the points about trying to think about who you are as an organization, I went over like thinking about what you're going to be really good at, but I think it's also about trying to think about who you are as an organization and where you want to continue to push and build a brand, because building your organization's reputation on a particular set of skills is going to be really important for your advocacy in the future. For example, at Results, we pride ourselves on having a really amazing volunteer network, a really great grassroots volunteer network that does some like really high, what we call high barrier engagements. So engagements that aren't easy to do. You can't just go online and sign a petition, but you actually have to book meetings with your member of parliament, write letters to the editor and op-eds. And that's something we pride ourselves on having. And so when we're trying to think of tactics, we're trying to think about how we can also continue to build that reputation and grow that so that we can continue to be really effective advocates in the future. And then also in your point about government funding, that's always a bit of an interesting point. And I think something that a lot of organizations try to struggle with is when you're receiving government funding, what can you and can't you say, and how do you balance that as well? And it is quite difficult. And I think something that both has legal and financial implications that organizations or people have to really consider quite a lot. Fortunately, at Results, we don't receive government funding, and so we're just an advocacy organization. It gives us a bit more liberty, but it's not something I think everyone has the advantage of. So yeah, sorry, any other questions? I realize I jumped in there. Feel free to type them in the chat bar as well if you'd like. And we will have another section for questions at the end. So, Robin, do you want to take some of these questions?
Yeah, I think let's talk about lobbying versus advocacy, because this is a question that came up last week as well. And you'll see that we circulated a Google Doc where all the questions that we had received from you, Results Canada staff took the time to respond to in that Google Doc. So we'll reshare that, and you can go back to that to just reread that. But lobbying versus advocacy. So like activism, we see at Results Canada, we see lobbying as just one of our tools within our advocacy toolkit as a type of tactic that we can use. So lobbying is defined, I guess, as engaging members of parliaments and power holders. We also tend to use the word of advocacy, as somebody pointed out on last week's call. Lobbying kind of has a bit of a negative connotation associated with it. And I think that's just because of the historical way in which lobbying has been used. A lot of big corporations are putting a lot of resource and time and energy into lobbying members of parliament and critical decision makers. But we need to be at that table too. Us that are advocating in the interest of ending extreme poverty, we need to be at that table as well. So at Results Canada, we put value in lobbying in the same way that a bigger corporation might do, but we just see it as one aspect of our advocacy toolkit and just a tactic that we can use. I think, just being aware of time, we should probably dive into our breakout session rooms now. And again, we will collate these questions in Google Doc and respond to them there. And hopefully we'll have some time for more questions when we come back from our breakout rooms. So just before you move into those, you're going to go into your breakout rooms that you were in earlier. And each group is going to have a scenario to work through. And really what we want you to get out of this is to discuss amongst yourself as a group, based on your scenario, who might be some campaign targets or decision makers or influencers for your advocacy ask, what your advocacy ask might be, and hint, it should be in the scenario itself, so don't spend too much time on that. And then try to identify at least, say, 3 tactics that you think would be strategic and smart to apply in the context of trying to achieve the goal and ask of your scenario. All right, and each room will have a facilitator, so don't worry, they will guide you through. We'll see you back shortly.
Okay, so yeah, thanks everyone. Hopefully, it seems like you all had some really good conversations. I know breakout room 5 was also fantastic, and I'm just going to say that because I see other groups here. I'm feeling a little competitive, as always. So thanks. It was some really great conversations. Does anybody have any questions they want to go over, either that came up during that discussion or beforehand? I know that we had a bunch of questions also in the chat, so I'll maybe let people respond first, and then we can answer some of those chat bar questions as well.
And also feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself, so there's more voices being represented.
This is Gertrude. I think for our group, we had such a good discussion about our scenario was the health insecurity that's coming in the wake of COVID-19. And we just had a good discussion about how to position our ask when internally in Canada, we have some of the same kind of issues. And so I thought that was quite interesting, and I'd like to hear other people's perspective on that.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that, Robin, immediately? Or?
I do, but I also think Chris would be great to respond to that, because she is always talking about how we live in a duplex these days. So if your unit is on fire, the other unit can be on fire really quickly. And I think she does a really great job of articulating this. So I just want to open up the floor to other Results Canada staff as well, if you want to
Sure.
chime in and give your perspective and respond.
Yeah, I'm happy to, like, I certainly don't have any of the answers. We're kind of we're building the car as we're driving it. You know, this is a different world and this is a challenging world, and we've never really faced anything that has had the domestic impact, or it feels like it. And so, yeah, so how do we do global development advocacy, global poverty advocacy, without seeming tone deaf, without realizing that people are hurting here as well? But, you know, always, always, always need to be looking for the open space and the opportunity. I always talk about my daughter used to play soccer, and she would, you know, be practicing the field kicks. And as she'd line up to kick the ball, every time she kicked the goalie right in the belly, until finally the coach said, you know, you need to look for the open space. So we can look for the obstacle and recognize that there are challenges related to the domestic needs, and that shouldn't be an either or sort of approach. But looking at the open space, it gives us an opportunity to think now more than ever, we should be talking about, as Robin was saying, that we live in a global world and that we have a real opportunity to rebuild the world better than it was. If anything, the glaring inequities and the impact of those inequities are more evident now than ever because of COVID. And so we need to tap into that and be able to amplify that, Gertrude, through things like you were talking about, the storytelling and the tactics we talked about in our group. And the metaphor that Robin was alluding to was just that sense of, you know, it used to be that we would talk about our neighbor's house is on fire, but now no matter what anybody says, COVID teaches us that we live in a duplex. And so when our neighbor's house is on fire, if we don't invest in putting out the flames, then we perish too. And that is not just about self-interest, that is about collective sort of opportunity for, you know, fixing the world that we need. So there's all sorts of elements to kind of that are messaging related to all of this, but it's the trickiest question, but it's also the one we have to figure out, and we just need to figure out the opportunities to amplify the need for global response. That's my feeling.
Thanks, Chris. And I think you do a great job, as Robin says, of pulling that together, because I think we really need to continue to make sure that as advocates, we're also just, without actually simply saying it, we need to think about what's the right thing to do. What do we think we have sort of a moral obligation? And you want to make sure that you really are having that deeply embedded, and not necessarily just focusing on self-interest, but absolutely trying to think about why is it morally right, and how can we also show people that this is the right thing to do from a different perspectives as well. One of the questions we got in the chat, and I'm sorry, there seem to be a lot of comments, so thank you all for coming in here, is how early should you start working on a campaign, and how do you decide which influencer to go after with limited times and resources? And I think that there's not necessarily a right answer for either of those questions. I think they're both very dependent on the campaign you're trying to run, but obviously when you're trying to think about how early to start on a campaign, the earlier the better to start planning, because obviously you have more time to gather information, identify targets more concretely, work out your messaging, try to get like really concrete. But the one thing you want to really try and avoid doing is trying to start your campaign, like actually go too public too quickly, too early, because you're trying to make sure you build momentum to a final moment. And if you start with a big flash in the pan really, really, really early, you might not be able to actually create the change down the line that you want to in 2 or 3 years, for example. So trying to think through, like, what's the moment you need a decision made, what's the timeline that you're working with, and trying to think about how to build to that moment is something that I think is really important. And for the point of how do you decide which influencer to go after with limited time and resources, I think the power mapping exercise that we talked about is really good for that. And which, if you would remember, is the chart where you have your influencers based off their ability to create a change versus their natural support of what you're trying to go after. the further in the more support somebody has for you and the more influence they have, the more important they are to go after right away. And that's why it's really like really important trying to focus those people first if you have limited time and resources, and try to think about the people that you can easily outreach. And I think Chris has jumped in here. In that case, it would be the Minister of International Development, and then who influences her. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I think this is some of the. Yeah. So this, as Chris pointed out here, yeah. If it's an ask, you're seeking resources. That's always important to follow the money and do your research, which is absolutely true, and try to figure out who's actually responsible for that. Any other last questions here?
One of the questions I'm just reading, and maybe I think is a one that comes up a lot, is the idea of our group seem to land on more than one ask. So how are multiple asks typically integrated into an advocacy campaign? I think it's really important. You might have an overarching goal that's broader, but when you're looking at which decision makers have influence, you often want a common ask, and that can help you narrow in on your tactic. And I think there is some confusion sometimes that your common ask that's broad, you might have different things you're asking influencers to do to help achieve that. So when, say, you might have, my common ask is just jumping off this, we want more money for the World Food Program. Okay, who influences that? We know the Minister of International Development does. What you might ask of her might be different than what you might ask of, say, a influencer you've identified, a journalist who's interested in this issue. You might ask them to write an article in a newspaper, that's your ask for them, that highlights the importance of the World Food Program, but you might ask the minister to directly fund it. But it's all leveling up towards what your objective is, which should be similar and should be fairly broad. At results, like our overall mission is to end extreme poverty, which is extremely broad. And then we have different campaigns that level up to that and many different asks, but the campaign should be specific. And if you have too many asks, you're just going to kind of lose focus. So I would focus on having one overarching strong one and then kind of go from there.
That's
I see Luke Stopping just raised his hand. If you want to come in quickly, and then we'll wrap up. That'll be our last.
Sure, just very quickly, and I was raising this actually just before we came back in our breakout group. One of the things we always struggle with is once you define that very specific ask or specific target, the amount of length of time that you commit to reaching it, because often campaigns are time oriented. And I'm just wondering, generally, do you find it better to set, okay, we're going to work on this for 3 years, regardless of whether we achieve the result we want or not, we're going to work on it for 3 years? Or do you commit to, like, this is what we want, we're going to work on it until we get it?
Yeah, I think that that is a really good question. And I think, again, what you want to try and think of is thinking of when you actually, like, thinking of the time bound piece of your smart ask. Like, when is the decision need to be made? For example, when we're thinking about the vaccines work campaign, we have ongoing replenishment cycles, and those have sort of time limits to them of when we need those resources. And so if you have that, it's really clear because you know that you need to get a goal by this specific point. Which is then you can build your strategy backwards from there. But if you're working on something like that doesn't necessarily have that exact decision point, you want to try and find moments that can lead you to that, right? So is there an opportunity that you can build towards? Say you're working on climate change. There's the COP conferences, which are really big international moments where the world comes together to try and solve climate change issues. So thinking through, like, how do you create that build up to that particular moment and try to achieve that goal? It will, I think, depend on your goal and what you're actually trying to achieve. But I think that's generally what you're trying to do, is think, well, what's the decision moment you need, and work backwards from there.
All right, great. We're going to wrap up now. So let's just take a quick sneak peek at next week. Next week, you are going to be led by Lindsay, who does our parliamentarian work here at Results Canada. So you're going to look at who's got the power and what the ins and outs of parliamentarian advocacy are. Just to know, if you haven't registered for that session yet, please do go and actively register. We will email out the slides as well as the recorded presentation from today after the event. In that, you'll also get a workbook, just like you did last week, and we'll have some questions there that will stimulate some more thinking around the scenarios you did, and where you can just take note of some of the targets you identified, the tactics you identified, etc., so you don't forget those. And Lindsay, do you want to take the floor to ask participants or share with them what their piece of homework you want them to do and come prepared with for next week?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really excited to see everybody next week as we're going to be diving into parliamentary engagement. So definitely a fun topic with lots of interesting information. So the homework to you all is to find out who your local member of parliament is, and that can be based on your postal code or the riding you live on. So it might take some research and some digging if you don't already know. And then I'm just asking if you can find some interesting information about them, something that maybe ties you to them or something interesting you learned about them as their role in Parliament. So I'm looking forward to seeing everybody next week. I want to thank Robin and Kenneth for the amazing presentation they put on today.